Where do you want me to stay?
Why don't you sit right here, okay, and then, or right there, either wherever. All right, everybody. Is this, I'm not sure if that mic is working, but good. Okay, we're all set. Good. So thank you all for coming out on this Patriots Day holiday. Beautiful weather, hopefully drew people out, but I have a feeling we have a number of people off at the marathon and things like that. But thank you all for making it. I know there's people signed in online as well, so welcome to them. So this is a beginning of a very special week for us here at the Asia Center. We are going to be hosting Professor Ed Garcia this entire week, and then capping it off next Saturday also with a book launch for the book 6 Filipino Women for Justice, which will be a big event from 2 to 5 p.m. on Saturday with a reception afterwards. So you can check online for all the different activities associated with his visit. Professor Ed Garcia is a Filipino human rights activist, a peace advocate, and a writer. And the origins of this talk really began back in August of 2023, just with a very simple message I sent to Professor Garcia. He didn't know me from anybody else, and I knew of him, and I had started a Philippine lecture series 3 years ago that I wanted to invite him to give a talk for. This wasn't part of our effort at the Asia Center to do more on Southeast Asia, but in particular on the Philippines as well. And so I got a very kind message back, but it also was a message where he said, you know, I don't think I can fit everything I want to say into a single lecture. And so we had an email exchange and decided that rather than do it as an online talk, as I had been doing many of those so that we could reach audiences in the Philippines, that we would do this and invite Professor Garcia and his wife Teresita to come to visit Harvard and make this a series of talks over 3 days to really tell this history. And so we're really, in fact, when he wrote back to me, he responded, "I am definitely interested and would like to share lessons I have learned in a lifetime of work on human rights, social justice, and the struggle for democracy." And then our conversation then led to not just one talk, but this series of 3 talks. So Professor Ed Garcia received his early education at Ateneo University in the Philippines. And there he studied with the very famous Filipino Jesuit, Horacio de la Costa and Roque Ferriolas. And he did further studies then on peace research at the University of Uppsala, at the Peace Conflict Analysis Center, and at the University of Oslo, Blindenherd campus. And then he went on to do a fellowship at the University of Otago Peace Center in New Zealand. Although he's really best known for having served as one of the framers of the 1987 Philippine Constitution, wherein he advocated for the inclusion of human rights and social justice provisions in the charter under the membership of the CHR Commission, and also with the acknowledged so-called father of human rights, that is to say, Jose Diokno. I don't know if I pronounced, I hope I got it right. Yeah. And then in the 1970s, he co-founded the militant youth political movement, Lakas Diwa. And the movement had a very distinct political ideology, namely Philippine social democracy, and it sought to create a nonviolent path towards social change through what he called the parliamentary of the streets, that drew on diverse resources that range all the way from Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. to liberation theology, and included indigenous philosophies as well. So the group was conceived as an alternative to the Marxist-Leninist Maoist ideology of the Communist Party of the Philippines and the National Democratic Front, the NDF, which called for armed struggle. In the 1980s, then, he went on to found Kakbay, and in the 1990s, Kilos, the Coalition for Peace, and the Multi-Sectoral Peace Advocates and the National Peace Conference. Since then, Professor Garcia has served as a researcher at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International and as a member of the Board of Trustees of its local chapter. He's also served as a peace envoy and political advisor at International Alert, a non-governmental peace-building organization doing work in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and Europe. And it's incredible how much time Professor Garcia has spent in around the world, but particularly in Mexico and Latin America as well. He taught political science at the University of the Philippines and Latin American studies at the Interdisciplinary Department of Ateneo University. He has lectured regularly at the Escola de Pau at the University de Barcelona and at a number of universities throughout Europe and New Zealand as well. In 2015, he was conferred the Parangal Lingkod Sambayan, a public service award by the Ateneo University in the Philippines. He has written many opinion pieces, published many of them in the Rappler, and is also the author of a number of important books, including The Filipino Quest, which I have a copy of here. These are hard to come by these days, and also Courage, published in 2018, among others. I have to say, after being able to secure Professor Garcia for talks here, I went back and reread The Filipino Quest, and it really impressed upon me how so much of our education begins not in universities necessarily, but out on the streets and in the environments where people are dealing with the real problems. And for me, it really hit home, particularly his chapter on dealing with the bases, U.S. military bases in the Philippines. And as somebody who was born just outside the gates of Subic Bay in Olongapo, it really hit home. I was born there in 1965, and so just some 20 years later or so, well, actually 30 years later, here was the decommissioning of Subic Bay. But the chapter that really hit me was the chapter that he wrote on his work in Central America, and particularly the chapter on Nicaragua. In 1984, like younger students, I had just finished my sophomore year in college and went to work in Belize, right on the Guatemalan border, to do archaeology. And I knew nothing at that time of what the politics of what was going on there. And it was really that trip that gave me a crash course education in the complicity of the U.S. This was, for those who didn't live through that time, going back to the Reagan years, and given that missiles are flying from Iran, this was a time when the U.S. was supplying arms to Iran to make money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. And so traveling around the region, I could see the effects of that movement that was going on illegally. Some people will remember the name Ollie North, who was one of the conspirators in that. But seeing blown up bridges, having violence still on the streets right in the border areas along Nicaragua. So basically that was a crash course education, and rereading that history in Professor Garcia's book really impressed upon me how the importance of that kind of work he was doing with the people. I think some people that we meet, and I've had many opportunities as the director of the Asia Center to meet people who have done really incredible things, big moments in their lives where they've done something very important and in many cases made them quite famous for things, and they are known throughout history. But there are also certain types of people that, in addition to those kinds of things, have also created a whole life that adds up to something that's truly noteworthy and noble. And I think that Professor Garcia is a mixture of both of those. He was a framer, one of the framers of the 1987 Philippine Constitution, but it's really the other work that's created a whole life of commitment and principles that stands out to me personally. So his first of lectures is entitled "The Struggle Against Dictatorship," and this will launch us on our journey with him, which is often how he characterizes his life. If you read his books, describes his whole life as a kind of a journey. And his life, as you will see, is intimately tied up with the modern history of the Philippines and his commitment to the fundamental principle that there can be no lasting peace unless the poor and the powerless also achieve social justice. So what is noteworthy in Professor Garcia's work is not just that he identifies the problems, but he also aims to chart an alternative future and a world in which a lasting peace is something that is still possible. And I think this is a message we especially need at a time like ours, in which peace still seems elusive and something we have to fight for every day. So I will invite Professor Garcia up to the podium here, and please join me in welcoming him to Harvard, and also the beginning of this week of lectures that we will have by him. And so please, I'll bring you up. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, first of all, James and Tenzin, I am truly grateful for having worked with you during these past few months. It's been a really wonderful experience, and without your assistance, I would not be here today. I am a teacher by profession, and I have always believed that the first task of a teacher is to be taught. And so I hope you don't mind if I go around, and we're not too many.
Yeah.
And if you could just introduce yourselves, I'd like to know more about who's here. And just a few words. Would you like to start? Yeah.
Sure.
Speak louder. So.
Hi everyone, my name is Karen Bonsigignac. I'm a first-year master's student at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm proudly from Las Vegas, Nevada. Fun fact, over 50% of the Asian American Pacific I'm very interested in human rights in both the US and the Philippines, so this feels like the perfect event for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Tenzin?
Hi, my name is Tenzin.
Thank you. Would you?
You know who I am.
Gita?
Gita Wiryawan, I'm from Indonesia. I'm a fisher. Government of the Republic of Indonesia. I was the Minister of Trade, and before that.
Thank you.
I'm obviously the wife, Teresita. Thank you.
She's also my most fervent critic. So later on, I'll mention this.
Richard Sander, I'm a 2010 graduate of the Kennedy School. My son and my daughter and son-in-law served in Manila.
Oh, really?
Working for the U.S. Embassy there for 3 or 4 years. Enjoyed it very much. And my son-in-law was actually first secretary for political affairs in the Philippines, reporting to Ambassador Kim. I don't know if you know Ambassador Kim, but he's recently been transferred someplace else. But anyway, they enjoyed their tour of duty in the Philippines, and I'm very much interested in hearing your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Michaela.
Can you speak louder so we can
Sure,
know?
yeah. I'm Michaela. I'm a grad student over here, and my dad was in the Army, so we moved around a lot, but I went to high school in Manila, and since then we've kind of traveled back and forth, but I never really got the opportunity to kind of learn about Filipino history, ironically, going to high school in Manila. And yeah, I look forward to learning more.
Hi, my name's Juvie Hartweg. I'm a Boston Public School science teacher, and I'm half Filipino, and my dad is American-born. And I spent my first years in Filipino school systems until I went to live with my grandparents, my American grandparents here in America. So I was around during the Iraq crisis and to watch the Subic and Clark bases close down. And one of my memories, a challenge that I had was there was a lot of backlash towards Americans, and my dad being an American, still lives there by the way, and having that part of my culture also, I was kind of on the fence. So during that time was not a very happy time for me as a half American, half Filipino. So I'm very involved here in Boston, part of the Filipino American Association. So this is very important to us. So we will be coming to see you in the next few series. A few of us are coming to the other series, and definitely on Saturday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Brandon. I was a student here. I'm originally from California. I used to go to college and Berkeley College of Music, and now I just live and work as a production technician and musician around Boston. And I'm here today because I organize Filipino community for on the issue of human rights and democracy through Malaya Movement, Massachusetts. And I was very excited to come to this when I heard about it because it's like very relevant to the work we're doing right now. And yeah,
Thank you.
that's it.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello. Yeah, my name's Carson. I'm an MDMB student here. I have some family friends who are Filipino, so that's also why I just wanted to come here to learn a little bit about Filipino history and just like your take on it, because you're part of the committee that wrote the Constitution.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, do you want me to introduce myself? Okay. I'm Julie Story. I work in the Harvard University Asia Center.
Asia Center, right?
Yeah, she's also the hidden people that make everything happen, actually.
Right.
Jackie's up there too, so yeah.
Hello, I'm Jackie. I also work at the Asia Center as a programs coordinator, and I'm just happy to be here. Yay.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for introducing yourselves. I feel very grateful that you come during a day that's very full of activities in the city. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say something about April 15. I was thinking either by serendipity or perfect planning. We are here on April 15th, Patriots' Day, a memory of the first battles in Arlington, Lexington, and Concord of the American Revolution, which happened April 19, 1775. So it's a moment of remembering. So I said to myself, what an amazing coincidence that we begin the series of lectures on Patriots' Day. Secondly, it's also Boston Marathon Day. And now on its 128th edition, it's a celebration of the human spirit. And if you will notice, actually, one of the themes that we will discuss is marathon mentality, the Boston Marathon mentality. And then the third event is what I call Be Brave Boston. 10 years ago, I think 4 people got killed at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. And the first time I heard the response of the people was Boston Strong. Is that correct? Yeah. Boston Strong. So I said to myself, what an amazing coincidence. In Greek, we would call it kairos. Kairos, an opportune time, a moment of grace. So I am grateful that we start this series on April 15. Now, allow me to kind of outline what we will be doing during the next 3 lecture days. The first one, as was mentioned by James, is struggle against dictatorship, the struggle for independence. Waging peace requires a marathon mentality. And the third one is reinventing resistance, to be brave, to be strong. And those will be the themes. And so let me just explain briefly you know, the reason why I gave the title to this series was after reading the book written by Drew Gilpin Faust. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this former president of Harvard. She quoted, or she asked permission from John Lewis and asked if he could use his famous phrase, necessary trouble, as the title of her publication. So, as you can see in this other chart, the title of the book that Drew Gilpin Faust wrote was Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Mid-Century, published in 2023. How many of you have read that? Yeah, I'm sure some of you have. And it's a memoir of awakening and activism, blending the personal with the political. And then, the person she quoted, John Lewis, and he said this in Selma 2020 to commemorate Bloody Sunday 1965. And this is what John Lewis said. Speak up, speak out, create good and necessary trouble to save the soul of America. And then I said to myself, there was another time when the word trouble was part of my life. I played a very minor role in a play written by Robert Bolt, Man for All Seasons. It's about the life of Thomas More. And during the execution, which is Act 2, scene number 10, the executioner takes off his mask and becomes the common man. And what did he say to the audience? He says, "It isn't difficult to keep alive, friends. Just don't make trouble." So, in other words, these were some of the meanings of trouble, which is part of the title of the overall title of the lecture series. So I say that in this series of possible conversations, I have dared to employ the same term in the Philippine historical context, where I have had some involvement or experience over some 5 decades. So in these 3 different sessions, I will attempt to discuss the themes from a personal point of view, as a participant observer, and as a reflective peace practitioner. The struggle against dictatorship. As an overall theme, I lift a quote from Milan Kundera. You're familiar with Milan Kundera, the novelist. And he said, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." It's very important to remember. And so, before I discuss what went on in the first quarter storm, in the declaration of martial rule, the repressive years of martial law, the assassination of Ninoy Aquino, and the drafting, and the people power and the drafting of the Philippine Constitution, I said to myself, it's important to contextualize. The historian Horacio de la Costa, perhaps one of the most important historians that we have produced, he's a Harvard graduate, 1951. He said, contextualize. If you wish to remember or wish to understand historical events, it's important to contextualize. And so I would like to contextualize the first quarter storm in the 1970s and its aftermath in the context of 1968. Because the year 1968 and the events which took place during that year made a tremendous impact on the thinking, on the attitudes that our generation imbibed, our generation inspired by these experiences. So this was Generation 68, the defining moments that shaped our thinking, our mindsets. Sir, were you aware of what happened in May 1968 in Paris, France?
That was a tough year. A lot of events going on in the U.S. Assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. It overlooks me. I overlooked what else happened.
Okay, is there anyone else who remembers 1968? Or are we all very young? Anyone else? Yes, yes, ma'am. Okay. Okay, so let me go back to May 68. The movement began at the university in Nanterre, the outskirts of Paris. And then it moved to the Sorbonne. Some 22,000 students, they rebelled against discrimination. They rebelled against the antiquated educational process in the university. For 7 whole weeks, there was civil unrest in Paris, in France, until the students joined forces with the trade unionists and workers and came out in force, 1 million people strong, challenging the government of de Gaulle, General de Gaulle. And that was so important because it changed the face of France. The coming together of students and trade unionists. And those of us, I was a student then, those of us in the Philippines were obviously amazed at what happened May 68 in Paris, France. Anybody remember the Prague Spring? Does anyone remember the name Alexander Dubček? He tried to put a human face to socialism by liberalizing travel, media, and teaching. However, what happened was that there were 46,000 tanks and 135,000 troops from the Warsaw Pact that was led by the former Soviet Union to crush the Prague Spring. So for us, this was a very important event, the crushing of the Prague Spring. Those of you who have seen the film, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, do you remember the kind of scenes that were projected where the people changed the names of the streets to confuse the invaders? So they resisted. And this was a very inspiring moment for those of us who were watching the events taking place in Czechoslovakia. This, I'm sure, most of you have memories. I was in a gathering of 17 students. We were preparing to leave for Mindanao. So these are my former students. And I said to them, it's important to be exposed important to see another part of the country. So we went to Mindanao. But before that, we had to gather in prayer because Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, was killed in Los Angeles. You know, he was espousing civil rights, also anti-war positions. And 2 months before that, in April, in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King was killed. So can you imagine, you know, the turmoil? Can you imagine what was taking place in the U.S., as you previously mentioned, because of the U.S. civil rights and anti-war movements? And what took place later was that Lyndon Baines Johnson had to desist from returning, you know, to aspire for the presidency. He desisted from aspiring to become a re-elected president. Do you remember there is another important event, and I'm wondering if you would remember. I wish I could stand on this table. Do you remember this? Sorry? What happened there? All right, so Tommy Smith, who won the gold, and John Carlos, who won silver, they both raised their fists in protest about what was going on in their own country, right there at the podium. So the reason why they only had one each was that John Carlos lost his gloves, so they had one each. This is recounted by Tommy Smith in his book. And that shows you how this thing became a global phenomenon. In fact, the Australian who finished third also showed solidarity by lining up for the Olympic human rights pledge. So they were all, the three of them, part of this protest. For me, there's another incident that is important in 1968. And this was the Selam Declaration of the Latin American bishops. Would anyone care to comment on that document? Does anybody remember any line or any theme from that document? That document is a groundbreaking document because it identifies institutional violence, that the poverty of the people in many parts of Latin America could be called institutionalized violence. And that's why what they recommended was the preferential option for the poor. And this, in a sense, was inspired by a man named Paulo Freire, who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and then the book Teología de la Liberación, written by Gustavo Gutierrez, who was my teacher in Peru. So all of these events conspired to create the atmosphere, to create the setting, the background for the events that then took place in the Philippines. So what are some of the lessons that I drew from 1968? First, repression seldom works. It breeds unrest, it provokes resistance, and it brings about courage. Second lesson, memory is a powerful tool. Attempts to blunt the memories of past events seldom work. Third, ideas whose time has come. It is difficult to contain the winds of change. Fourth, citizen is the most important word in a democracy. And you, young people here, and those who are young at heart, you are harbingers of change. The citizen is the author of the changes that are required in societies today. And there is a fifth one, which is the meaning of moral courage. So let me go to you a line, and perhaps you will remember moral courage. It is important not to mistake courage for a man with a gun. When you are licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and see it through no matter what, that is courage. I'm sure all of us have read this book by a particular author. Would anyone want to guess? No? Who is the author who wrote those lines? You've read the book, all of you. In the film, Gregory Peck won the Best Actor award. You remember that? It's about a bird. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And it's for me, it was very important. I read that the book was published in 1960, became a film in 62, but I only read that book in the late 60s. And I was very impressed, because the meaning of courage, especially in our time, those young Filipinos who wanted to resist dictatorship, they said, armed struggle is the answer. But, these lines from Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird, no, it's not a man with a gun. No, courage is not that. It is when you are licked and yet you refuse to give up, you become strong and brave, and you continue till the very end, no matter what. That's what courage is all about. Water break. Is there any comments, questions so far? I'd be very happy to get a contribution from anyone. All right. The brewing storm. It took place on the 26th of January, 1970. There was a call for a non-partisan constituent assembly. And our young people, I was part of that demonstration, wanted to ask government to make sure that partisan political interests do not interfere with the drafting of the Constitution or the rewriting of the Constitution then. And so this protest was met by truncheons, met by violence from the side of the police and the military. And so on January 30, the students went to the palace to continue their protest, and it became violent, and it was called the Battle of Mendiola. Mendiola is the stretch of street that from the bridge to the palace. And so the students tried to crash the gates of the palace, but the soldiers and the police, they used their firepower, their force, to try to beat back the students. So the social unrest continued from there. And I recall testifying before the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee to describe what I saw on the streets. I actually went up to the bridge because I saw a radio patrol car. And so I said to Ronnie Nathaniels, who was the anchor, I said, may I please address the people from the bridge and tell them not to get in harm's way and to ask the military, the police, to stop shooting unarmed civilians. So this was a very tumultuous, very difficult period, the social unrest which continued. It was also during this period, after what was taking place, and then what we call the Parliament of the Streets, that we wanted to form a movement that would insist on the importance of civil disobedience. In other words, some of us felt to fight fire with fire, especially, we didn't have much in terms of, wherewithal, arms, or, we said we have to fight the dictatorship with civil disobedience by inflicting not harm on others, but on ourselves, to be able to say to the powers that be, we are against what you are doing. And so I recall it was a classroom that was not the amphitheater style, a classroom. I was then a seminarian. It was a classroom at the Loyola House of Studies. And so this organization was being formed. So I said to the president of the National Union of Students in the Philippines, Edgar Hobson, I'm not sure if you remember the name. I said, Ed Jop, his name was Ed Jop. Ed Jop, you will be the natural leader for this organization. But then he was reticent and he said, my plate is full. And then some other voices said, well, anyway, you're a seminarian, you're not doing anything. I was doing theology, actually. And so, by default, I became the founder. I became an accidental activist because I wasn't an activist then. I became the founder by default of Lakas Diwa. And, I was totally unprepared. I never studied political science at that time. I didn't have social sciences. I studied the humanities, philosophy, and theology, which did not seem to be relevant for the role that I was being asked to perform. And so what did I do? I had to ask Father de la Costa and other Jesuit superiors, to ask for a leave of absence so I can spend more time on the streets and less with the books that we were required to read. And that was the beginning of Lakas Diwa. And so martial law was then declared in the guise of suppressing and quelling communism and the Muslim separatists in Mindanao from September 21. That was when martial law was declared. And it took something like 14 years, 72 to 86. And Amnesty International, actually did a rigorous assessment of the martial law years and identified 70,000 people who were arbitrarily arrested, 35,000 of whom were tortured, 3,257 killed. And even the Commission of Human Rights, which is a constitutional body which I helped to sponsor while we were writing the Constitution, identified 11,103 cases qualified for compensation. So you can see there are really numbers cases. But sometimes the figures are cold. So allow me to tell you a story. Does the name Emmanuel Yap, Manny Yap, ring a bell? Any of you? Manny Yap was among the best and the brightest. His father was a human rights diplomat in New York, and he brought his whole family to Manila during that period. And Manny Yap barely spoke Filipino. Or if he did, he spoke Filipino with an American accent. Is there anyone here who speaks Filipino with an American accent? How do you speak? Can I hear you? Huwag ka na mahiya. Anyway, Manny Yap was so amazing because he was one of the brightest in that batch in the school. And he was so committed. So he became the person in charge of the political education of those who belonged to Lakas Diwa. So what happens? On Valentine's Day, 1976, he is made to disappear. I spoke with a person who last saw him alive. In fact, she's coming here on Friday. And she tells me, we had a date in a small restaurant on the eve of Valentine's Day. And Manny Yap asked his father and mother to please buy him a bunch of red roses. Apparently, he was going to give the roses to the girl. But before it could happen, Manny was snatched. He was made to disappear by a unit from the Philippine Constabulary whose main task was to harass and kidnap activists. And so we never saw Manny Yap again. Years later, we received a letter from the prison saying that Manny Yap was tortured. He was electrocuted. And because of a heart condition, he died. And they threw his body in Montalban, Rizal, in a well, and covered the well. He has never been found, disappeared. And so, his life, sometimes one man's life is sufficient to make us realize what martial law repression meant. And there are many other cases we can recount. Disappearance. In the Philippines, we have a word. I'm sure some of you know, salvage. To salvage someone is to kill. In fact, it is very sad because that word has returned to the country. And those of you who have read the book by Patricia Evangelista, some people need killing. Some of you read the book. It's really a testimony. She calls it a memoir of murder in my country. So this is not anything new. In the time of Duterte, it happened in the time of Marcos. In fact, I forgot to mention the invocation that was delivered by Father Pacifico Ortiz in Congress during the violence that ensued mentions what was going on in the country as some kind of social volcano. And so it passed that, in fact, the brewing outrage, of people, was building up, especially after the return of Ninoy Aquino. I'm sure many of you here would remember what took place. The soldiers entered the plane, they held him, they brought him down the side of the plane, and then the words in Visaya, "Pusila, pusila," which means shoot. And he was killed on the tarmac. And what is strange in our country, is that they never were able to identify the principal author of this assassination, of this murder. And so therefore, there was so much outrage. There were two lines I recall which I will never forget. The first one is, "Hindi ka nag-iisa." When Ninoy Aquino was killed, the refrain, the chant, "Hindi ka nag-iisa." Who would like to translate that? You are not alone. And then there was another one, which is, "Tama na, sobra na, palitan na." Tama na, sobra na, palitan na. Stop. Enough. Change. So, this really created the assassination of Ninoy Aquino was a landmark, an event we will never forget, August 21, 1983. And so then, in a sense, that was how the people were further unified, further enraged. You are not alone. Now, before that, there was another incident. People tend to forget another assassination, another killing, which happened just before the People Power uprising. Would anyone suggest which killing this was? Does the name Evilio Javier ring a bell? Governor. Yes, thank you. Evilio Javier was a friend from the same school where I studied. So when he decided to run, he was he graduated law school, was a law professor. He never had any experience in politics. So I recall, he said to me, "Ed, tulungan mo ako, help me in the campaign." So I went with him to Antique. We went from town to town. And the campaign was aimed really at the young people in Antique. It is one of the poorest provinces. And Evilio Javier won. he became the youngest governor of Antique. After winning several terms as governor, he decided it was time for a break. So where does he go? Where does Emilio Javier go, you think? James, any suggestions? Harvard University, JFK School of Government, correct. And so Emilio Javier studied here in this same campus and because he wanted to be more prepared. So he comes back in time for the snap elections, where Corazon Aquino, the widow of Ninoy, was selected as the candidate who could unify all of the opposition. And Emilio Javier volunteered to be one of the poll watchers to make sure the votes are counted in Antique. So what takes place? Emilio Javier, while watching the polls in Antique, he is chased by 4 gunmen who pump in 28 bullets into his body and killed him. In cold blood. He was running away to escape the assassins. And so his body was brought to the campus of the Ateneo, and it was in a football field. It's called Erenchum Field, in honor of the coach of our football team. And I recall it was a huge gathering in the football field, and then Jaime Cardinal Sin sends a message. It is justified to get involved in a non-violent struggle for justice. I still recall, it's so fresh in my mind. We were jumping up and down because we said, it is just. We can continue to struggle peacefully, and we will not be afraid. But the killing of Emilio Javier took place just a few days before the People's Uprising of February 22 to 25. Very often it's forgotten, but it's a very important event. Okay, some turning points. I recall hearing on radio, you see, the radio that broadcasts the truth in our country was called Radio Veritas. Does this remind you of anything? Radio Veritas. And I heard on radio distinctly Jaime Cardinal Sin and Butch Aquino, the younger brother of the slain Ninoy Aquino, calling people to assemble because there were rumblings within the military camps. And they stood up, at least members of the reform armed movement, to say, enough. We will not continue to support the regime. Hearing this on radio, I still remember it so clearly. I went out to the streets. It was a full moon. It was a full moon. So the weather was perfect for walking. So I walked, just like today's weather, And so I went there, and I was surprised. I said to myself, people just kept coming and coming and coming. So I said, this is incredible. There is a potential for something significant happening. So the next day, I drive my old Volkswagen Beetle car. Do you remember the Beetle, the old Volkswagen car? Which was a veteran of many demonstrations. So it was all run down. I drive to the house of Pepe Diokno, number 55, 3rd Street in New Manila. And Pepe Diokno tells me, Ed, can you drive me to number 11, the house of, in 13th Street, the house of Lorenzo Tañada, who was, in fact, together with my father, one of the founders of the Civil Liberties Union of the Philippines. And they were joined by a third person, Jovito Salonga, who was the president of the Liberal Party. So I remember this meeting of minds, the three of them. I was like the fly on the wall. and Pepe Diokno said, we should not get involved. We will be cannon fodder for crushed between the two sides of the military. Salonga said, wait, let's wait for developments. Then the old man Tañada steps in and says, only one way we can resolve it. I will go to the camp and talk to the defense minister, who at the time was Enrile, and the military commander, Fidel Ramos. And so he said to them when he went there, gentlemen, is this for real? Is there no turning back? And when they answered in the positive, said, no more turning back, then he said, okay, we're in it. And so he comes back, meets up with Pepe Diokno, Salonga, and then they say, this is for real, let's get involved. Now, there were two events that I would like to mention that for me constituted turning points from a personal perspective. There is a road beside the military camp, Camp Aguinaldo and Camp Crame, that's called Santolan. Does anybody remember that street, Santolan? There are many stores there. Many of them are owned by officers and soldiers. So the group of seminarians led by Father Catalino Arevalo, he was there, tried to block the tanks that were coming in under the command of General Artemio Tadiar. And they were instructed to just bulldoze themselves and break the gathering that was becoming huge. But his soldiers could not move because the people refused to budge. I'm sure some of you have seen images. Maybe later on when we hear the song of Jim Paredes, Handog ng Pilipino sa Mundo. Alam ba niyo yon? Do you know that? Handog ng Pilipino sa Mundo. You know, the images of people with their bare hands trying to stop the tanks, and then the soldiers getting demoralized and turning back. So for me, this was the 23rd of February, one of the turning points when the soldiers and their commanders realized that the people were not going to budge, even at the cost of their lives. The other, on the morning of the 24th, dawn, 5 o'clock in the morning, we were awakened by the sound of 7 Sikorsky helicopters. And we thought this was it. We were going to be strafed. And so we just sang the Our Father and marched towards the military camp where we knew there was a landing field. So we entered the military camp, and out of the 7 Sikorsky helicopters from the 15th sky wing of the Philippine Air Force, soldiers with M16s and white flags came out. And then they were saying, Laban. In other words, the soldiers had turned around. And I said to myself, this was a turning point. We expected a bloodbath, but it was redemption instead. So that was the eve of the downfall of Marcos. And the next day, at Club Filipino, Corazon Aquino was sworn in as president. And another set of helicopters came to Malacanang. And these were U.S. helicopters carrying the Marcos family and their cronies with loads of cash, jewelry, paintings, and incriminating documents and evidence against their plunder. And this really became a very important event because it sounded, the end of dictatorship. Of course, we did not expect that there were also going to be reverberations of people's power abroad. So I had many examples, but I decided to skip them. I'll just mention a few to give you a glimpse of the people's power experiences that took place in South Korea in 1987. Strong men disarmed. In Nepal, 1995 and 2005, the monarchy was brought down by peaceful protest. Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution of 1989, and the call of people, Havel to the castle, because the presidential offices were in the castle. Those of you who have been to Prague, it's going up there. Estonia, singing revolution from 86 to 1991. Latvia and Lithuania's human chains of freedom that took place on August 23, 1987. These were kilometers and kilometers of people, in between the capitals of the three countries that sought to be free from Soviet dominance. Then Poland's Solidarność movement to the fall of the Berlin Wall, 88 to 91. And then finally, Georgia's Rose Revolution of November 2003, Ukraine's Orange Revolution, and Kyrgyzstan's Tulip Revolution that took place in Kiev and Bishkek in 2004. But there were also two people's uprisings that were brutally crushed. You remember that, right? The massacre in China's crackdown, June 4, 89. And then 8888, the 8th of August, 1988 in Myanmar. This particularly struck me because I was asked by the Brut for die Welt, the Bread for the World, to be part of a teaching team in the Jungle University, where many of the students who fled the repression in Myanmar went to a Buddhist temple outside Bangkok. And I remember how painful it was to listen to their stories and the brutality of the military in Myanmar, which had a great toll of fatalities, and the students were survivors. And so, what are my takeaways from people's power, the experience of people's power? Number one, the importance of a sense of common purpose. We have to be unified by a higher cause, a cause bigger than ourselves, a common purpose that would lead us to make sacrifices, to continue our task, no matter the cost. Strength in numbers and the 3.5% rule. Harvard's political science professor Erika Chauvet studied 323 civil resistance and social movements from 1900 to 2006. And they discovered that when 3.5% of the population get involved in the struggle for change, then, all things being equal, change becomes more possible. So that's a very interesting kind of conclusion, from the study, from the Harvard study on the strength of numbers. Third, resilience in the face of repression. Obviously, social movements and efforts for change will meet with repression, and the ability to survive, to surmount the sacrifice, to surmount the challenges is very important. No? So not to be cowed and stopped by repression. The fourth lesson I learned, the importance of the courage of the collective leadership. That there is courageous leadership that will take a stand, that will speak out, that will not be afraid. But at the same time, you need a solid rotation. It's a phrase I take because at one time I was also like a life coach for scholar athletes. And this is one of the things I learned in basketball. The importance of solid rotation. Can anyone explain that? What does solid rotation mean? They say stars can win games, but only teams can win championship. Caitlin Clark is a once-in-a-generation kind of an athlete, correct? From the University of Iowa. She's a fantastic player, broke all the records. But who wins the championship? The team with a deeper bench. Rotation. That's what it means. No? South Carolina perhaps had a deeper bench, had bench players who would score points, who would not be tired out at the end of the fourth quarter or nearly the end quarter. And Caitlin Clark could not do it all by her lonesome self, although she's perhaps one of the best players that ever graced the hardcourt. And finally, vigilance as watchword. And this is where perhaps many of us, in not only in the Philippines, but in other countries fail. We think once it's done, it's over. No. Vigilance is necessary. And that's why I go back to the myth of Sisyphus. So when you try to bring up the boulder on your shoulders and you think you're nearing the top, and then what happens? The boulder goes down again. and the effort begins again. So the capacity to push back against setback and not to be discouraged. Okay. I brought with me a copy of the original of the Philippine Constitution. We have 100 copies that we signed on October 16, 1986. Only 100 copies of this exist. 48 of us were given one each, and the rest were distributed to different departments of government. So I'm going to pass it around, and maybe you would like to look at it. It's one of the original copies of the Philippine Constitution. So, what was the background of the Constitution? First of all, it was written in the backdrop of the downfall of a dictator. So that what we tried to do was to create safeguards against the return of authoritarian rulers. That was very important to understand the context of the drafting of the 1987 Constitution. Secondly, the Bill of Rights. For many of us, to underscore the importance of civil and political rights, of economic, social, and cultural rights was crucial. And so we made sure that the Bill of Rights was not only complete, but strong. You know, I worked a number of years at Amnesty International, and I invited colleagues from Amnesty International to come to testify in the public hearings. By the way, I also wanted to share with you the very first intervention I made in the plenary of the Constitution, of the Constituent Assembly, was this. I said, it is important that the co-authors of this Constitution are our people. And so we should stop or pause and go out throughout the country to be able to listen to the thinking, to the aspirations of our people. And so we did. We actually paused and we went around the country. I went to Batanes, all the way from Batanes, Ilocos Sur, Ilocos Norte, then we went to Mindanao, Tawi-Tawi. And it was really an experience, you know, by plane, by boat, by horseback, walking, tricycle. You know, we spent time trying to meet with people. I recall an experience in Batac, Ilocos Norte. Are you anybody familiar with Batac? That's exactly Marcos country. I remember, you know, in the plaza, town plaza, I stood there, and all I could hear was booing for 5 minutes. And so I said, I understand why you're booing, so let me listen to it. For 5 minutes, the booing was continuous. After it died down, I said, I understand why you do not wish to accept this Constitution, but let me explain why it also protects your rights. So I could only explain after they vented out their own frustration and their feelings. What is the heart of the Philippine Constitution? Article 13. It's the article on social justice human rights, and people's participation. So the focus on rural and urban poor, indigenous people, women, and youth. So that's the first thing that comes out or is underlined in that particular article. On human rights to speak and assemble freely, to organize peaceably, to enjoy the right to a healthy environment. By the way, it's important to remember that in our Constitution, the right of the people to a healthy environment is given prominence, which then became a template for many other constitutions that were drafted. And then people's participation in the formulation and implementation of public policies. And then, obviously, all of us were asked on October 16, 1986, to give our final vote or verdict on the Constitution. And I said, this Constitution is an imperfect document. It's unfinished quest. There is struggle for further interpretation. But for us, it's important to have this Constitution. Now, let me end. I call this a necessary epilogue. The question remains, why are we where we are? After all that we had discussed, after all the improvements we tried to make, how come we are where we are? There are members of the Philippine Congress who say that the Constitution needs to be amended and changed. And my answer is that the Constitution is not the problem. The Constitution, in fact, is part of the solution. And thank you. The Constitution is imperfect, but the fatal flaw can be found in three areas. One, our institutions. Two, our policies. And three, our leaders. Our institutions are flawed. Our policies are not fit for purpose. Our leaders may not be fit to serve our people, not at this time. Our institutions are largely weak and unreliable. Our policies inconsistent with the needs of our people and their implementation ineffective. And our leaders are elected on the basis of perceptions, not on track record and their willingness to be held accountable. We, the citizens, are often not able to distinguish fact from fiction. I think you will have a commencement speaker here in Harvard, Maria Ressa, and she will be able to discuss, I'm certain, the whole question of disinformation and how a lot of people are deceived and are not able to distinguish fact from fiction. So, the struggle continues. Tuloy ang laban. We cannot rely on slogans, promises to make our countries great again. Actually, I said, I think I've heard that. We cannot rely on slogans. Make the Philippines great again, or make any country great again. We must rely on principled politics, resistance based on truth, and the capacity to serve the vulnerable. Much depends on our youth, wherever you are, at home or abroad. Those of you who are here, have a role to play. You and your friends, your classmates in this campus, the two Filipino Americans who are going to represent the country in the Paris Olympics. You have two Filipino Americans who, they have a role to play. They have a platform from where they can speak out. Does anybody know of the two Filipino Americans in the Olympics, the Paris Olympics team? I think one in fencing and the other one in sprints. So why, we may ask, must the struggle continue? We should not forget. We cannot forget. Why? Because we cannot forget those who have sacrificed their lives and those who remain in the margins of society. Their stories need to be shared. I shared with you the story of Maniap, of Evilio Javier, and Edgar Hobson. In fact, Edgar Hobson was captured alive in Davao. He had 8 bullet wounds. But since he refused to cooperate with the interrogators, he was killed. They all, studied in the same school, in the same campus. And so, I cannot forget. We cannot forget. So I go back to the line that I began with. The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. The struggle continues. Tuloy ang laban.
Thank you very much. So why don't we sit for a minute? We don't have a lot of time, but I think it would be great to have a few questions from you all. And not only does the struggle continue, but the lectures will continue on Wednesday, 5 to 7 here, and then on Friday. And before I forget, also tomorrow evening, please spread the word. In this room, we'll be doing a screening of the documentary, award-winning documentary film Delicado on the protection of the environment in Palawan. And so please join us for that. I think your final slide about not forgetting, I mean, this is, that can happen in many different ways. Here on a university campus, I think that's the role of education is one way to attack that problem. But education can only play a role if we represent those areas where we can preserve that memory, which is why I think the committing to building up coverage of areas of the world that are not presently covered at a place like Harvard, in fact, is a rather shameful thing that we have to fight in order to, I mean, there's a struggle taking place outside that has a history, and we have a struggle taking place even within the campus to try to get representations of these histories of places like the Philippines. So this has been a big year, and your presence here to tell this history for us is a very important one. This is the first year we began the year with the inauguration of the teaching of Filipino languages at Harvard, first in its nearly 400-year history. We have there's been a number of talks over the year culminating in your lectures this week. And then having Maria Ressa as the commencement speaker, only the second, first Filipino, but the second Southeast Asian, only the second Southeast Asian. I look back into the into the 1800s, and the only previous one was U Thant,
the UN
from Myanmar,
Myanmar.
Who was UN UN secretary, and that has been a long time. So it's a oh, I have to. I guess I'm not turned on here, excuse me. I usually speak loud enough, but so this is a historic year, I think, in many ways for not just Southeast Asia, but also the Philippines directly. And as part of remembering your story about Aquino and his assassination, We shouldn't forget that Aquino spent his years in exile right in Boston.
Boston.
Well, actually in Newton, just outside of Boston. And then Cory Aquino came and addressed the Kennedy School after his assassination. So there are so many deep connections to this area that make it all the more fitting that your lectures are taking place here this year. So thank you very much. So why don't, if it's okay, we'll open up just for a couple of questions, if you have them. Dick, right? Richard, or
Professor Garcia, thank you very much for the interview.
maybe use the mic, yeah.
Here's the mic.
Just because so people online can hear.
Thank you for the interesting lecture. President Duterte was not well known for human rights. I think you might agree with that.
Maybe the understatement of the year.
How do you feel about the president, current president Marcos, in that respect?
Actually, that's a theme of the third lecture. I'd like to invite you for the third.
He's come in from out of town, yeah. So
Can we collect
yeah,
the different questions? And
I'll send you an email with the answer, Richard. Yes, there's a microphone for you.
I understand that the Constitution has something about anti-dynasty.
yes,
I just heard from a friend, a couple of friends. Why and how we are still in the trap that politicians, families go over and over and then survive, even if it's against the Constitution. Thank you.
Any more questions? Maybe, yeah, please.
3.
Sorry, thank you very much for your presentation. Just sort of actually related to your to his question, I wanted to ask about the role of migration and what the role, what sort of a brain drain, you will, of Filipinos who have the ability, who have the talents, who are leaving the country. I mean, just like myself and my family. What role does that play? How big of a role does it play, and how is it connected to a phenomenon like dynasties? Political dynasties, or sort of a lack of knowledge of the past in the Philippines. That's So the role of migration, outbound migration of educated Filipinos.
Just had a question that might be a little bit more controversial. I saw in the Constitution that there's
Can
a
you
clear.
speak louder, please?
Yep, there's a clear indication in the Constitution of separation of church and state. I know for a fact that the Catholic Church in the Philippines is very much involved in our politics. It's a tricky situation, I think, because I went to school that was run by Jesuit priests, and Ateneo, another one. It appears to me that there's that role of the Catholic Church often inhibits the growth of democracy in the Philippines, and I know you had mentioned Cardinal Jaime Sin, and I remember him. So I'm curious: has there ever been a conversation about the role that the Church, the Catholic Church, has played in, where we are today? Does it inhibit the progress of, our nation to have, the Catholic Church having such a stronghold on the way, we do things, which is clearly unconstitutional, but the reality is that's really not the truth, right?
Yes, hello. Mike, thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting to hear about the 87 Constitution. But my question is, what are your thoughts on the recent controversial charter change? I understand that
controversial
charter change, cha-cha?
charter change.
Yeah. From my understanding, the current Marcos government is planning to make changes to the 87 Constitution, along with the many other things that are controversial with cha-cha. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Yes, that's my question.
Thank you.
Maybe one last question over here, yeah. Are you going to remember all these, Ed? You got them all?
Yes.
Okay, good.
All right, my question is kind of simple. So I'm just curious, like, because like the stuff you talk about, like, not never forgetting and like the memory of like of dictatorship in the past. I'm just curious how like the Marcos family were able to rehabilitate their image because
Sorry, speak a little slower. I cannot follow the.
how the Marcos family was able to rehabilitate their image because if I'm not an expert in Philippine history, but I know the father was exiled in Hawaii, so and was driven out. So I'm just curious to hear like how the son was able to, not just rehabilitate the image, but become so popular before he was elected. Thank you.
Shall I?
Please, yeah.
Let me start with Marco's questions. First of all, I want to say that the desire of the Marcos family or dynasty to revise Philippine history is bolstered by all the trolls, the use of social media, the use of disinformation. I think Leni Robredo was seated here when she actually spoke of the way they tried to destroy her personally, about everything she stood for was twisted. I heard on YouTube, I listened to James and Leni Robredo discuss everything that was thrown at her during the campaign, many false statements that were made over time. PP Leni was my former student, sophomore college at the UP. And I remember asking her, I said, Leni, aren't you going to prepare to run for president? And she said to me, no, I won't prepare because the presidency is destiny. Obviously, I didn't agree with her, but I respected her decision. But I said to myself, if she's going to run and run much later, she cannot cover the distance that the Marcoses for years have prepared, with their trolls, with their managers who massage the message, etc. And a lot of our people, as I said, who are poor and are not able to receive the kind of education that develops critical thinking, so they cannot distinguish fact from fiction. And so the difficulties remain. And as I said, regarding the Marcoses, shall I give you a short
sneak peek? Yeah.
Okay. I will say, on the third day of the lecture, our best kept secret in the country is no secret at all, and that is the president is a fraud. Why? Because he is complicit in plunder, complicit in the failure to acknowledge human rights crimes in the time of martial law, the killings in the time of Duterte, and thirdly, he is a person who propagates disinformation and the revision of our history. For the following reasons, he is unfit to be president, he is a fraud. That's a summary. Well, that's why I quoted to you Harper Lee. Courage requires that even if you think you're licked, you keep on fighting just to be able to make a dent, because we have another generation who can stand on our shoulders and look further beyond. And so I think if you reread To Kill a Mockingbird, which most of you have read already, this is one of the lessons that is, I think, was it Atticus Finch? Atticus Finch, the lawyer, who kind of symbolizes all that is good and,
President Duterte, I think most people were optimistic there would be changes. But
No. One of the flaws of the Constitution is our inability to make sure that political dynasties are eliminated. Why? Because it was difficult to assemble, in framing the Constitution, we have to take a vote on almost all provisions. And some of the members of the Constitutional Commission were in fact themselves members of political dynasties, so we could not decide right there and then. So we said, we will leave it up to Congress to legislate the enabling laws. However, we underestimated their capacity, their inability to make those changes. That political dynasties, at least of consanguinity, third or second degree, could not run. But we have how many brothers and sisters in the Senate, or mother and daughter, mother and son, who control entire provinces. That's why federalism, which can be a good thing, is not good for the Philippines, because we will just create fiefdoms, warlordism, specific areas of the country controlled by people. The church and state. What the Constitution prohibits is involvement in partisan politics. As you know, even Pope Francis, encourages involvement in political affairs that deal with human rights and social justice, but not partisan politics. So it's important to make that distinction, because in some cases, in some areas, like for example, Caloocan is a place where many killings are taking place. Bishop Ambo David is able to go to the pulpit and say, stop the killings. So that is a message coming from a bishop of a locality to say, look, this should not happen, in our land among brothers and sisters. And so they have to speak out as prophets, prophets of the truth. And so, but involvement in politics by becoming a member or supporting one party from another, obviously that is not desirable. And then Chacha, who spoke, Chacha. Charter change, I'm the first one to admit, the Constitution is imperfect. It should be changed sooner or later. However, it should be changed not by the very people who now compose our House of Representatives. They are in fact calling it People's Initiative, when it's not the People's Initiative. It's their initiative. And so how do you create that? In fact, that was the beginning of the first quarter storm, if you recall, when our generation, we were asking for a non-partisan constituent assembly. So it's important to make that point. The second question, who?
I asked a question about the outward migration of Filipinos.
Migration.
How does that sort of play?
When you say outward migration, you mean brain drain?
Yes.
You see, actually, it's funny because I mentioned that, James, your name appears in this memoir. One of the side benefits of preparing for this for a series of lectures is that I had to organize all my notes from day one. And so at the end of the period, I was telling James, the memoir wrote itself. So this is a first draft, a memoir of defiant hope, of possible peace. And we receive a lot of support from people who have worked and live abroad. But it is to our greater loss. My father was Secretary of Health in the Philippines. And one time I went around with him to all the provinces to visit the hospitals. We were in Agusan province, and he said to me, Ed, there are only 11 doctors in this entire province. And do you know the number of doctors and nurses who leave this country? He says it's criminal because we deprive our people of the basic services. Why? Because people need a better life. And the reason why people leave for abroad is because they're looking for a better life. Our nurses, our doctors are overworked and underpaid. So how can you blame them? And yet, this is causing a lot of distress, in our country. And that's why one of the reasons why I feel privileged to address you is precisely that I want you to remember the privileged position that you all have, that you can make a difference. And I hope you tell your friends, the other young people in our country, you have all the right in the world to have a better life abroad. But as we said in the beginning, never forget. Huwag niyong kalimutan ang pinanggalingan, di ba? Alam ba niyo yun? Huwag niyong kalimutan ang pinanggalingan. Do not forget where you came from. And we are going to be forever grateful because this diaspora of Filipinos, the Philippines is supposed to be quite insignificant in terms of geopolitics in the world. But do you know, without Filipinos, hospitals in the UK and other parts of the world will cease to operate. Without techies and technicians, in the Middle East, things will not be. In other words, the Filipino diaspora makes a difference. And I just hope that it also makes a difference at home. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Tuloy ang laban.
Good. Thank you. And I think we have a living example of the good, that notion of a brain drain, but also just going out into the world in Latin America and the experiences you learn that you bring back something to your home too, I think can be very powerful just in terms of not allowing, some people staying abroad, but also the interjection of new ideas, the kind of philosophy and political work that you've done, I think, would it have ever happened without that exposure to Latin America and movement? So travel, open your eyes, sometimes get out of our comfort zones at universities to do that. Thank you all for coming.
Tenzin is here.
Tenzin is here, yes.
Tenzin, can you play Handog ng Pilipino sa Mundo?
Oh, is this from the hiking club? The
Apo Hiking Society.
Society, that's what it is, yeah.
Do you know Jim Paredes?
Yes.
Jim Paredes was in 2G. He was my student. And Jim Paredes said to me, he says, Ed, I wrote this song in 3 minutes because he was so inspired by what took place. Because at that time, you can walk and feel proud and tall because you're a Filipino. And this is a playlist that I put together, and I wanted you to listen to the first one. Handog ng Pilipino sa Mundo. I had another experience. There was a 9-year-old girl from Sydney, Australia, and her father was a foreign correspondent. And the 9-year-old girl, Australian, said to the dad, Dad, when I grow up, I want to be a Filipino.
Good, so we'll use this as our closing song for tonight, and then hopefully see you all back here on either tomorrow night or on Wednesday, and then on Friday as well. But thank you again, Ed, for an opening.
Di na ko papayag, mawala ka muli. Di na ko papayag na muling mabawi. Ating kalayaan kay tagal na nating bitin. di napapayagang mabawi muli. Magkakapit-pisig, libu-libong tao. Kay sarap pala maging Pilipino. Sama-sama, iisa ang adhikain. Kailanman di na paaalipin. Hanggang Pilipino sa mundo, mapayapa para ang pagbabago. Katotohanan, kalayaan, katarungan, ay kayang makamit na walang lahat. Basta't magkaisa tayong lahat. Basta nang nagaganap sa aming bayan, magkasama ng mahirap at mayaman. Kapit-bisig, madre, pari at sundalo, naging langit itong bahagi ng mundo.
Huwag muling payagang umira lang dilim.
Tinig ng bawat tao'y bigyan ng pansin. Magkakapatid lahat sa Panginoon, ito'y lagi nating tatandaan. Ang Pilipino sa